further ado, we'll start the recording and get him going. So go ahead, Stephen.
All right, thanks. Let me go and share my screen here. Was it this one? It was just working a minute ago, so let's see if I can get it again. There we go. All right, can you guys see my screen? Looks like you can. All right, cool. So I'm going to talk about managing dependencies. Dependencies mean a whole bunch of things. I'm going to focus mostly on software dependencies. And then I've got an example that I want to talk through how I decided to choose a dependency for a project that I'm working on. Because apparently I do this in a weird way. I kind of do everything in a weird way. And apparently these, weird ways are sometimes interesting to people. So I'm gonna talk about this shit. There will be cursing, just so you know. I'm from Nova Scotia. It's just punctuation for us. So, oh, I forgot that there was cursing in my slide. So who the fuck am I? I'm Stephen Baker. I've been doing this for a while. I typically like to focus on like testing tools and quality improvement type things, and the kinds of things that make our jobs easier and done with fewer people and with higher levels of reliability and quality. If you use Ruby, you've definitely used some stuff that I created, even though I told you shouldn't use it. And if you write tests in any other language, you probably use stuff that was just a clone of that stuff, and I told everyone they should stop using it, and nobody listens to me. So since I'm giving this talk, people might listen to me, but if I actually wrote code and put it out into the world and said, don't use this, everyone would use it. So maybe that's why I don't do it anymore. So yeah, so my favorites are favorite platform to work on is Ruby. So some of this will be Ruby specific, not quite. I hope you understand Ruby. I do work in like 12 languages every day, so I can throw out some ideas for less cool languages. But Ruby just happens to be my favorite imperfect language. For reference, Smalltalk and Lisp are perfect languages, and every other language is imperfect. And Ruby is my favorite imperfect language. Okay, so that's a little bit about me. It seems fashionable to start out when you're talking with something with with a dictionary definition of it. And so what is a dependency? And the first thing is dependence. Well, thanks. That was a lot of fucking help. Okay. And then the second definition is something dependent or subordinate. Okay, that makes a little bit more sense, but it's still circular because it's putting the definition in the answer, and that's kind of stupid. But I really liked this one, which is a minor territory under the jurisdiction of a government. And that really mattered. That was a surprising one when I was looking up this information to create the slide. But it actually kind of makes sense because one of the things I'm going to talk about is if you poorly, in a spoiler alert, if you fuck up managing your dependencies, guess what? You are now responsible for the government, and the territory is now under your jurisdiction if you make a poor choice on a dependency. I'm sure there are lots of people working on JavaScript projects. This talk is definitely for you, and if you're using JavaScript in NPM right now, you might not actually understand. You understand the pain, but you might not understand that you can actually solve the problems of the pain, because the JavaScript ecosystem is terrible about dependencies, but also awesome. And I think I'm going to talk about that too. So even though I try not to say nice things about JavaScript. So we're going to talk about kinds of dependencies. System dependencies is one of those things, and these are like your operating system, or actually I would also include like environmental factors here. Like you have a machine that has many GPUs in it, you need it in a place that has a lot of good cooling. That's a dependency too, but we're not going to talk about those because hardware is for people who have brains. We're software people. So I'm mostly talking about operating system dependencies. And then there are runtime dependencies. These are the things that your software needs while it is running. And that's most of what we think of when we think about dependencies are runtime dependencies. What does your software need while it's running in production? And then the last one is development dependencies. What are the things that you depend on, but you only actually need them at development time? You don't need to ship your testing library or your mock object library to production with your software, but you do need, it's still a dependency that you have to think about. One of the things that I just realized I didn't cover very well in here is the interrelation between those dependencies. System dependencies are the thing that you typically have the least say over and the least and the least care about, because everything in production now is a Unix system anyways, or it's Windows, and then it doesn't work anyways, and so dependencies are not your big problem. And in with runtime dependencies, you do have some choice there. And development dependencies, you definitely have some choices, but you're probably not making your own choices. You're probably choosing what everyone else chooses, which is a solid tactic, which I'll talk about. So examples of system dependencies are the operating system, the libraries provided by the system package manager, and programs that you need to interact with. So I'm actually building some music lesson teaching software right now, and I need to dynamically generate guitar tab and sheet music. And so one of the system dependencies that I have is that GNU LilyPond is installed on the production machine because we're generating sheet music at runtime. We're generating sheet music so we can watermark them for the person who downloaded it. So that would be an example of a system dependency. It would also be an example of a runtime dependency. There's a lot of overlap here. So your operating system characteristics are type, version, edition, configuration. So the type is going to be, it's going to be Mac OS, California City version, whatever, or it's going to be, OpenSUSE, whatever, or it's going to be Debian, whatever. And there's going to be an edition. If you're in Windows land, you get the home and the professional edition, and they actually mean different things. And then there's configuration of the operating system. And yeah, so that's the configuration is also a dependency as well. I'm not going to talk about those things, but the things that you use for managing dependencies of systems are tools like Ansible and any of your CD pipeline, things like that. Libraries, which are typically installed using, every operating system either has a default or a de facto system package manager, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And libraries let you add capabilities to your system via an API, and I don't mean a web-based API. I mean literally the calling conventions to a library, and you'll use those from your application. Examples of system library dependencies are like, if your web application uses Postgres, you definitely need to have libpq installed so that you can actually talk to Postgres. That's the example of a library dependency, and you would install those with your package manager. Programs are other system dependencies, things like I said, LilyPond for me, or FFmpeg, you might call to it from the command line. Those are things that you would probably install with your system dependencies. Also, running that kind of stuff in Docker is kind of hard because sometimes it needs access to the GPU and stuff. So that's where you have to start thinking about system dependencies. And they're going to be managed using the system package manager. So package management on varies on different free software operating systems. We've got OpenSUSE has one called Zypper. Fedora has DNF now, used to be called Yum. Debian has apt. Totally reasonable. I didn't put on my slide here about the BSDs. NetBSD has package source. OpenBSD has OpenBSD ports. FreeBSD has FreeBSD ports. Those are slightly different. On Windows, it's weird because there is no default package manager. There are two, one that are sort of de facto. One is called Chocolatey and one is called something else. I don't know. It was probably called something boring because it's a Windows program. And then Mac OS, the de facto one that everyone uses is Homebrew, but the better one is MacPorts. But nobody uses that. So, and we're going to talk about that, about, do people use this being one of the vectors of choice. So system package managers, the tooling solves versioning and dependency resolution. They do it in a really fantastic way. They're very thorough about testing. How does, in Debian in particular, I was a Debian developer when I was a kid. When a new version of Postgres was packaged, we had to then run it through all kinds of different situations to make sure that it wasn't breaking the rest of the system. And that's usually done really well, and in a robust way. So now we'll talk about runtime dependencies. This is anything your application needs to be in place to be able to run. They can sometimes be managed by the system, but often you'll do it in your package manager. So I think the Python people have like package.txt or something, and they use virtual environments. In Rubyland, this is your gem file. If you're using JavaScript, it's going to be your package JSON, your yarn lock, or whatever other things that JavaScript people use. Every language has a different kind of one, and I maybe in a future iteration of this talk I'll talk about my opinions and why I think that's a terrible thing, but generally you're going to be tied to getting a lot of your runtime dependencies using the tooling that that's provided by your language. Development dependencies are definitely going to be managed by typically anyways, almost definitely going to be managed by your application stuff. May not include all the runtime dependencies. Sometimes there are things that you only need a runtime. For instance, if you are using Postgres in production, but you use SQLite locally, which is something that I do sometimes, I don't need Postgres, which is a production runtime dependency, but it doesn't apply to my development environment. And those tools are usually related to your stack. So like on a Ruby project, I'll use one of the Ruby linters, probably Rufo, because the rest of them suck. But it might also be Rubocop because that's what everyone else uses. Let me see if I can move forward here. There we go. Application dependencies is sort of a separate category, as a subset of runtime things. Is anything that helps your application do something that it could not previously do, and that's where I'm going to focus on the example and stuff. Is when I need a capability, but I don't want to write all that code myself, I'm going to reach for a library. That's what I'm going to talk about in terms of the example. Like for instance, you might have a program that needs to left pad a string, and you could take 10 minutes to write that yourself, or you could download it from NPM and take down the internet. So this is a hilarious story. I guess this is the point to talk about. Even though I find the JavaScript ecosystem and community to be largely awful, one thing that JavaScript ecosystem did better than anyone else is they encourage the reuse of very tiny pieces of code. Because their tooling is really good at saying, hey, we've got some code, we're going to ship it over here. It's very tiny. Left pad is a perfect example of that. It's also an example of why things go badly when your project has like 12,000 dependencies. So there are positive and negative things here, but one good thing about the JavaScript ecosystem is that they encourage that sharing of libraries and code. So mark your calendar, I said something nice about JavaScript. Another type of application dependency will be a framework. If you work in Ruby on Rails, Rails is the framework dependency. A framework dependency is different in my mind to a library dependency because a framework dependency changes how you structure and organize your own things that you created. So a framework dependency is something that you have to take even more seriously than just any old random library dependency. And the framework you usually will have less say in, so I'm not even going to talk about that very much, and definitely not in my example. So the main thing here is about choosing dependencies. And I want to run through an example of how I choose dependencies, and hopefully this is what you can take away. And I have no idea how long or how short, how much longer I'm going to talk. I apologize, but this is the first run through this material. So we're going to talk about choosing dependencies. So the considerations you need to have in mind when you are choosing a dependency, choosing a library or a framework is, what is the license? Is the documentation, does it even exist and is it any good? What is the support or the community like? How is this going to integrate into my application? What language is it implemented in? And what's the code quality of this dependency like? Is it likely to cause me problems down the road? And so the questions you're going to ask yourself for license, and that's the British spelling of license. I believe I have both spellings in here. I'm not wrong, you are wrong. So the question you're going to ask is, am I allowed to use this? I worked at Sony for over 3 years as the open source license compliance officer, and it turns out that actually a large chunk of things that people think they're allowed to use, they are not actually allowed to use, and they use them anyways because they just don't know how to read licenses and stuff like that. But the information is out there. And also anybody can feel free to email me if they have questions about software licensing. I'm not your lawyer, but I am willing to be your expert. Documentation, can I learn how to use this? This is sadly lacking in a lot of places. It used to be, a foregone conclusion that the documentation was going to exist and be comprehensive, but now not so much. I was once on a team with a guy that we got from the UK, and we were talking about our team opinions about dependency management and how do we decide whether we're taking a dependency in or not. And a lot of those opinions match these opinions you're learning here. And he said, oh, well, on my last team, we had a rule that documentation must exist and it must not be a video recorded by a spotted teenager in a baseball cap. So documentation comes in all forms, and some of them are superior. Support and community is an important one. Can I get help with using this thing? And can I find others who are using it? This is for when things go badly. And integration. How much do I have to do or change to be able to use this thing to improve my life? The implementation language. Can I read and understand this code? That's less important to me, but it's important to some. And code quality. Can I trust this thing? And I am going to take 10 seconds here because I just got asked if I want some lunch picked up. And my friends ditched me for lunch. So I did that now. Can I trust this code? Comes down to code quality. There we go. So the law about dependency management is that every piece of code that you depend on is de facto your code. You will be responsible for it someday. And all of the things and all the questions that I'm going to talk about here are the ways that you try to limit the risk of being responsible for that code, but also understanding, assuming I will be responsible for this code someday, am I willing to be? And how can I make sure that it's going to be the easiest possible way? But you definitely will be. So when the people who had left pad even as a transitive dependency in their project, they became responsible for that problem someday. We've recently had some security issues with the XZ compression library. You become responsible for everything that you depend on. And this is one of the things that's not talked about often enough when people talk about the problem that doesn't exist, which is open source sustainability. Open source sustains itself just fine. It's not a sustainability problem, it's a capitalism problem. So here's the example we're going to run through now. I needed to be able to drag and drop sort columns in a Ruby on Rails app that I was building. Basically, think of Trello. That's the kind of thing I was thinking of. I need to be able to sort columns of cards and cards within those columns. So my first question was, what would a custom implementation of this look like? I know enough JavaScript to be able to do drag and drop myself. The next question I asked myself was, do I actually want to write this much JavaScript myself? And the answer is almost always no. The second question was, what is the size? What's the magnitude of this project? Just that little bit. And then the last question I always ask myself is, am I in the business of writing? Is the purpose of the software I'm developing, is the purpose of that to provide the world with a JavaScript library for sorting things? And the answer is no. I just want to be able to sort things. I don't want to become the sorting things on the screen expert. So those were, some of the things that I asked myself when I got started with this. And I did do a bare bones implementation as a spike just to see, how much of a distraction is doing this myself going to be? So the next question I asked was, does something exist? And so I looked around and I found sortable.js. And it matched my opinions. You can see from the description here, reorderable drag and drop lists for modern browsers and touch devices. That's excellent. That's all stuff I want. And then it said no jQuery or framework required. So I know that the transitive dependencies, the dependencies of the dependency are going to be minimal and not suck in something that I hate or something that's bad. So that's already a very good start for this library. So the next question I need to ask is, does it do what I need to do today? And so I'm going to go look at the documentation for that. And I found they have a grid example, which lets me drag things around in a grid. They also had another example that let me drag things down inside of a thing in the grid. So you could have like nested stuff. And so I knew, okay, this actually does everything that I need now. Now, at this point, most people who are less careful than I am might just reach for the dependency and say, okay, that's it. We're going to ram this into the project. But I'm very conservative in this way. And I did not ram a new thing in my project because I know that I'm going to become the sortable.js maintainer someday. In the fullness of time, it will become my responsibility. So first thing, am I allowed to use it? MIT license, check. I can use it. MIT license is the I don't owe you shit license. That means I can do whatever I want, use it in any place. whatever. The MIT license is also why people whine about not being able to get paid for doing work on open source. The reason why you're not getting paid to work on open source is because you chose the wrong library and that's your own fault. But that's an entirely different talk for an entirely different time. MIT license, always safe to use for any purpose. Can I learn how to use this is the next question I ask. And from this website, you can see they've got a list of features and each one of those links shows you the sample code. Here's an example of it working. Here's the code you need to make it work like this. The documentation was pretty good. The README was super comprehensive. The next thing was the support and the community. And so for this, I look for a few things. First of all, can I pay someone to fix shit if it comes up? That's the number one question. And so they do have a financial contribution model where I could go ahead and just probably hire somebody on that list to add a new feature or fix a bug that I really cared about. That's really important to me. I want to know how many people depend on this thing. Well, it's got about 2,700 dependents from NPM.js. It's also got 63 million downloads from JS Deliver, which I don't have that screenshot here for some reason. It's got 1.5 million weekly downloads from NPM.js. It's got a lot of forks, a lot of stars. One thing that is true of this project, but wasn't when I was choosing it, is that it does have a lot of open issues and some pull requests, but the code is maintained, but it moves very slowly, which is a thing that I consider important. I want it to move slowly. I don't want you moving my cheese every week. So to answer the questions, can I get help with this? Yep. And can I find others who are using it in case I, want to try out a new feature and hope that somebody else will try it as well? Yes, there is a community of people around this. That's also good. Next thing I want to know is how much work will I have to do to actually use this thing? And also, how much will it influence the rest of my application? In my application, it's actually a Ruby on Rails 7.1 project where I use import maps. It's a no-build JavaScript thing. I just use bare stimulus controllers. How much code do I need? Well, this is the entire implementation of my usage of sortable JS. And I'm showing that because what this tells me is if in the future sortable JS sucks or I can no longer use it or need something and I want to switch libraries, what is the dependency surface of sortable JS in my application? And you can see here the entire dependency surface is 30 lines, including white space and stimulus overhead. It's actually probably only about, if I inline some of those variables and stuff and code golf the shit out of it, we're talking about maybe 10 lines of code. So the dependency surface of this, it's very low risk to get into my application. And it's also probably very low risk to replace it with something else because the operability surface is very, very narrow. The implementation language, can I read and understand this? Okay, well, it is JavaScript and I do hate JavaScript, but sometimes it's a thing that you can't avoid. I went and looked at the code for it. The bulk of the code for this library is in one file that is 2,000 lines long. And I immediately thought that file is way too fucking big. And then I started reading it and it's well documented. The code is well formatted. It's very easy to read and understand. I would be very happy to have to be responsible for this library down the road if everyone else who maintains it disappears and I want to continue using it. So that's another one, I wouldn't have done it necessarily the way that they did it. I don't like how few tests there are around things, but it's well used enough in the community. We know it works pretty well. It's been pretty robust in my application of it so far. I'm actually pretty happy with it. And the code quality, can I trust it? Yes, it has some tests. It's got a lot of hits per month from JS Deliver. There's that screenshot I was looking for. A lot of people are using it, so I can probably trust it. The code quality looks fine, and so on. I can probably trust it. So I made the decision I'm going to use this, but before I did that, I want to ask myself, what does the worst case scenario look like for adopting this dependency? And I know this is going to sound weird. I literally go through this process every time I'm looking for a new dependency. So the worst case scenario is I can't hire someone from the contribution pool. Either I can't afford them or they just don't exist. They've all dried up. Maybe they all retired on they're out sailing on their yachts because they wrote an excellent JavaScript library and I just can't find them. What about if the documentation doesn't tell me how to do a thing that I want to do next, or or how to add a feature I need or something like that. And then the feature I need doesn't exist. Okay, that's also terrible. So when those things happen, congratulations, you are now the maintainer of a library that you just wanted to use. Now, the worst case scenario there is that I'm now the maintainer, but it's a relatively small code base. It's well documented, has some automated tests, not as many as I would like, but I'm always welcome to add them. The code is easy to extend and understand, and it's plain old JavaScript, so there's no bullshit in it. I would be very happy to take on this dependency because even though it's a liability, I consider it to be a low risk, small level liability. And I want to go through I want everyone to go through this process every time you add a dependency to your project. So in summary, every dependency is a liability. You need to plan as though you will eventually own this. I plan every new Rails project I start up, I plan for eventually owning all of Rails myself. And guess what? I can probably handle that. Most people can't. I can probably handle being entirely responsible for Rails if I had to be. And I do that down the line with every other thing. One of the other things that I forgot to mention here is I also stick to the defaults, although maybe I'm saying it now, it's coming up in a future slide and we'll both be surprised. But typically, I want to use whatever the defaults are for the framework. So for instance, people find it hilarious that I don't use RSpec. And the reason I don't use it in my Rails projects is because it's not default. Minitest is default. But fear not, I wrote part of Minitest too. So if you're doing testing in Ruby, then you're using shit that I wrote, and I'm sorry. But I will always stick to the defaults unless there is a clear and obvious improvement. And I don't see a clear and obvious improvement using RSpec. I also hate Haml. I think it's stupid and overhead, and it's non-default. So I'm not going out of my way to use it. I also don't like Sass or Tailwind. I don't go to my way to use those things because they add overhead and they don't give me anything in return. And I definitely do not want to be responsible for maintaining Tailwind someday. Things, and when things become default, like for instance, Rails 8 is getting authentication generation. I will go through all of my current Rails projects and remove my usage of Devise, which is the authentication library in Rails land, and replace it with the default, because that also aids going through upgrade processes to get the new security stuff. I don't use view components. It's funny, this is a talk about dependencies, and I'm listing off all the things that I never depend on. So we're those are things I just want you to take away from this, that adding a dependency is a thing that should be not taken lightly. So carefully consider the consequences. The consequences are, this is going to cost me money or time. This is going to cause me hassle. This is going to cause me production downtime. This is going to, take away from being the, using this thing in the future and actually just being responsible for it. I have a story I want to tell about that, which is not a software dependency related thing. But years ago, I did some consulting for a company that made a single application for the Newton message pad. And they started building it. I think they launched it in 1996 or 1997, about 4 months before Steve Jobs came back to Apple and axed the Newton message pad line. And so this company had just formed, just built a new piece of software for the Newton message pad line. And then just as they went to market, Newton message pad went away. Well, guess what? This company was called Fortitude Technologies, based in Nova Scotia. They became, through necessity of Apple having axed the platform that they delivered their software on, they started going on eBay and buying up old Newton message pads and dedicated a part of their factory floor to refurbishing old Newton message pads. And then they also had to buy a compact flash company so that they could pre-install the software on a memory card that they knew was good, and then sell a used Newton message pad that had been refurbished with their software pre-installed. And they did this for about 6 years before they stopped running out of Newton message pads to be able to buy, and they contacted me to help them move off of the Newton message pad platform. So everyone thinks, oh, it's never going to happen to me, right? There was that old saying, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. Well, I'm sure by now people have gotten fired for buying IBM because there are not many things that you can actually buy from them anymore in that way. So these things can and will happen. By the way, I'm not suggesting that you use a cross-platform thing for mobile applications because you think maybe the iPhone will go away or something like that. No, you should never use those cross-platform applications because you're just building really terrible to use applications. But when you want to deploy something on Apple's platform, that is necessarily a risk you're taking, just like my past client necessarily took the risk to build it on the new message head because nothing else could work the same way. So sometimes you have to take these risks and don't make worse decisions to avoid a risk, because it's relatively low risk that Apple's going to stop making iPhones next year. It's pretty high risk that they're going to do something else stupid that will make it harder for you to get your app in the App Store. But DHH will save us from that, and so will Epic Mega Games. So that's all I have to say about that. I would like to open it up to questions if anybody has questions or thoughts or complaints, or just wants to tell me to fuck off. That's fine too. I don't know how you guys usually handle questions, but I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. So if
Yep,
anybody wants
this
to
is
ask
it.
questions.
This is how we
Yeah.
handle.
All right, cool.
I do have a question. Can you hear me?
Alright.
I don't,
Yep.
I just want to make sure. Okay, cool. When you're actually using a dependency, like is there sort of a line in how you'll use that dependency in your application? You know, like will you create like an interface and have that as an implementation, or does that dependency come into and is part of your application?
That's a great question. So it depends. Sorry, that's the most terrible answer.
Oh, it's okay.
In the case of sortable JS, that when I looked at that, I thought, okay, do I want to make interface segregation principle, I guess, right? The ion solid. Do I want to make a wrapper for this thing, or do I want to just embed it directly? The thing is, Stimulus already gave me sort of the wrapper and the way to integrate it. And where I would draw the line, it's a very arbitrary place to draw the line, but where I would draw the line is how much effort is it to just integrate this thing? And if I do it directly, how much effort is it to remove it? And in the case of sortable JS for me, we saw that it was, 30 total lines of code, which I also have tests for, and I didn't show you, but I wrote tests for those. It's 30 well-tested lines of code. That seemed like a low risk place to not wrap it. That was enough of a wrapper for me. In the case of a framework, more frameworky type things, like in Rails land, view components is a great example of this. When you use view components, it sort of puts its tentacles into all kinds of other parts of your project sometimes, and actually especially using Tailwind. And so I want to be very careful. What does integrating this with my project look like? And so I would always ask myself the question, in addition to what happens when I become the de facto maintainer of this, what happens when I want to rip this dependency out and put a new one in? And you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it. Just, give it 10 minutes of thought, and at least you've thought about it. Maybe write down the document, maybe document the decision somewhere. I'd write that in the commit message. I've chosen this library because of these reasons, and it will no longer be useful to me when these things are true. And I might even just put that in the body of the commit message, because when somebody 5 years from now is going, oh, why did Steven put this fucking dependency in here? They can go and look at the commit message and see exactly what I was thinking when I did it.
Yeah.
So, there's not the short answer is there's not a hard line, but definitely look at, how would I remove this and replace it with something else? Is sort of the question I would answer.
Right. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you.
What are your
Any other
thoughts on really large, like Swiss Army knife type dependencies versus good at really one thing?
So my preference is, really good at one thing. But when I say really good at one thing, I mean really fucking good at one thing. Sortable JS is so good at everything related to sorting any kind of thing. And it's tiny. So it's sort of best of both worlds in that way. I'm very careful about frameworky things, as I said. And I'm especially careful when a dependency then changes how I do normal things. Here's a great example. A great example of this kind of thing that ends up in a lot of projects is a dependency that I really like and I'm really careful about adding, and it's Lodash.
Yeah.
Lodash is a library that gives you a lot of FP inspired function applicators and so on for JavaScript, and it's absolutely fantastic. But when you add it to your project, you definitely want to run around and replace all of the not Lodash usages of it with Lodash. And so it ends up touching everything in your entire project. And so I'm very aware of that, and I still add it in most cases anyways. But I usually say, does the benefit that this provide me offset the downside? I'm trying to do a risk and issues, and qualitative analysis on the risks here. So yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I think of it like a guitar player building a pedal board, because some pedals you have on all the time, that's your tone, but it's in everything.
Mhm.
But like some things you just switch on for an effect every now and then. And those are, I think I tend to think about those completely differently, like in code. Like is the
Right.
like, is this going to make my tone really good that I want it on everything?
Mhm.
Anyway.
And sometimes sometimes in that case, to carry on that analogy, which is a really great one, there are modifications that can move to off of the board, and it might be the first thing outside of your DI. Like that might be the first thing. Or Brad Paisley bends bends strings so often that he had a B bender installed into his Telecaster.
Yeah.
Jimmy Olander, who played for Diamond Rio, has a double bender. He's got one that goes on the guitar strap button for the B string, and one for the G string that attaches to his belt loop. Right. And that's because he uses those effects so often. He wants them higher up the stack. Now, he can't play that music on he's Jimmy fucking Olander. He can play anything on anything, but it's not as easy for him to play the music on a regular guitar that doesn't have those modifications. But it was important enough for him to make those permanent modifications so that they can go with him everywhere. And that's something that a lot of people, do this in Rails land in particular. Almost every project that has in Rails has authentication, and nearly all of those use a library called Devise. Devise kind of sucks in a lot of ways, but guess what? Everyone's using it, so it sucks the same for everyone. You're not at a disadvantage for using it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts, complaints?
Yeah, maybe. Hi, Stephen. I'm Claude. I heard you were from Nova Scotia, right?
I am.
Okay, I'm from Gaspé. I went to Moncton University, so we're close.
Nice.
All
Nice.
right. So I'm a UI developer for 20 years. I've been in the industry. I know most frameworks. And recently I started calling it like the frameworks bandwagon, because we got stuck with those frameworks. They change every 2 years. It's hard to follow. Now they sell certifications and courses. It's a big industry. But
Yep.
really, developers are really having problems because it's hard to maintain. It's most of the time over engineered. They have to come back with simpler solutions 2 years after the fact, like it happens all the time. Like Angular is doing it right now. Same thing with React. Vue.js is a bit less troublesome, but they still had a pretty good, pretty big update recently.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody wants to sell their frameworks. And
Yeah.
then they invented SSR, which, as a matter of fact, is not even necessary because it's already supported out of the box with
Right.
Node.js and Express. Like, that's what I'm doing. So what's your opinion about that?
So one of the interesting things about those frameworks is that first of all, you were able to say, look, they change every 2 years. This is a risk because you have experience. But a lot of people don't have the experience of things being, the rug being pulled out from under them on these things. And so it's really important to look at that. The other thing that I think is really important with dependencies, and this should have been on a separate slide, is what is first of all, what's the likelihood that this thing is going to disappear or stop being popular anymore? And in JavaScript land, it's very high, with everything. But the other thing is, this thing that's existed for a little while, what problem did it aim to solve? And is that still a problem? And this is where I decided, I used Tailwind very briefly and then stopped using it. And I stopped using any kind of asset precompiler like SAS or whatever, because SAS existed so that we could have
Variables,
but variables. Basically, yeah, it came all the
Yeah.
way from variables.
and now they're supported. So-
Right. And so now we have variables that are supported in bare CSS, and we have nesting, and we have Flexbox and grid layout.
Yeah.
So you don't need Bootstrap anymore because we have grid layouts. We have variables. We have, eventually the de facto stuff might catch up with ES6 and JavaScript. In the early days of Rails, people stopped writing JavaScript and started writing CoffeeScript because they liked it better. Well,
Yeah,
JavaScript got enough better that we didn't feel like we needed to write in CoffeeScript anymore. And I would make the same argument that TypeScript comes from a time when JavaScript wasn't good enough, and now ES6 is good enough that TypeScript is a waste of time. But I also have strong opinions on the lack of necessity for static type systems. And so I think that looking at what that's another key decision point. What problem does this solve, and do I actually have this problem today?
so there's a lot of hype, so I'm
Yeah.
trying to use JavaScript, bare vanilla as much as I can,
Mhm.
but the market is not really there. Like they want the latest version, and even though they don't know what really are the differences.
Mhm.
So sometimes they let's say view the I would say that they branded a new kind of tool, like they call it teleport. Yeah, but what is it? Basically, it's probably just an observable or pops up, automated. It's always been there. I've been using it for 10 years. Nothing new, nothing new to me, but for them, they think it's a new feature because it's been sold that way.
Yep. Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of this, and the JavaScript community is especially terrible at it, or actually especially good at it. In sort of shifting public opinion and the new hotness changes.
Yeah,
So
there's a big front-end nation conference, 3 days right now. It's all publicity and offers, but it's all about money.
right. Yeah. So yeah, that's great. Thanks for making me think about that. Awesome.
My pleasure.
Hey, in the realm of the new hotness, it's not so new anymore, but have you played with Nix yet?
Yes. And now Nix is not my favorite implementation of that idea. I like Geeks better, which is the GNU implementation that uses Scheme as its description framework. It's a very interesting solution to a problem that I wish didn't exist. So what Nix and Geeks and similar things do, for those of you that don't know, is it basically uses symlinks to make sure that when a thing is running, it only has access to the things it depends on. And the problem it's solving is having multiple versions of a library on the same system and conflicting with each other. This problem is also solved by containerization. But in the Nix sort of flavor, there's a lot less overhead, and it doesn't require kernel support. I think it predates Docker actually, or C groups actually existing in the Linux kernel by a couple of years. So it's a really interesting solution to that problem. My preference on it is that I move all the software that I use as a cohesive whole through over a period of time, so that everything is caught up. But I do use a bunch of software that uses old ass versions of stuff. So sometimes it's not always it's not always nice. But Nix and Geeks definitely take a really interesting look at dependency management on the system level, and they're worth paying attention to if you really like that stuff. Yeah.
All right, thanks. I haven't played with it enough yet. I keep thinking I'm going to, but then I kind of need to be in a moment of need to really dig in.
Yeah, so the other thing about it is the reliability problem that it solves is actually there are other solutions to that problem. If you look at Fedora Silverblue or OpenSUSE Aeon, I think it's called, the role not they're immutable root distributions. And so you wind up just running most of your desktop applications get run in a sandbox instead, which is a sandboxing and static compiling are a different method of dependency management. And that's where the immutable distributions come from. So there is some interesting work happening in this space for a while. And that's another thing I probably should have talked about, but I didn't. So, cool.
I didn't
We're helping
carry
you
any
improve your
shoulds in
talk.
with me, so sorry.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. All right. Nobody's jumping up to shout more words, so maybe it's time.
All right.
Cool. Awesome.
Thanks everyone
Thanks,
for
Steve.
joining us, and thank you, Stephen, for the wonderful talk.
Thank you, folks. This was fun. All right. We'll see you soon.
All right.
Take care, everybody.
See ya.
Steven.